Hello, this is Adrian Tepes, and today I am going to be explaining the alternate timeline of Castlevania, known as Lords of Shadow. I am going to cover its basic concepts, the main characters of the alternate timeline, and its relationship to the greater Castlevania franchise. This topic of the Lords of Shadow timeline was chosen by a community poll, conducted by you, my dear audience, and polls and trivia postings can be found in my channel's community tab. Also, in progress is a collaboration between myself and Hail to the Jew regarding a crossover between the Fallout and Castlevania franchises, with the playlist in the description. Without further ado, let us begin with the story of the Lords of Shadow. When making an alternate continuity from the canon continuity, there is usually a foundation of previous canon or alternate themes pursued in such a story. In Marvel Comics, this includes the Marvel What If stories. In DC Comics, this included the Elseworlds imprint for years until that imprint was discontinued, but ultimately, alternate universe stories did continue in DC Comics with the Injustice series, later sequels to The Dark Knight Returns, alternate character origin stories, and more. But the guiding concept for a non-canon fictional story is nonetheless, as the alternate universe stories in Marvel Comics asked, what if? In the making of the two Castlevania Lords of Shadow games, the story attempted to ask three large what-if questions. What if a Belmont became Dracula himself? What if the lineage of Belmont and Dracula were one and the same? What if the son of Dracula became a key figure in perpetuating the Belmont lineage? All three of these questions were set up by previous Castlevania games and other media, some of which were retconned from canon or were never hard canon to the franchise. What if a Belmont became Dracula himself? This question is one which thankfully in Castlevania's original timeline and the Igarashi canon did not happen, with two notable bare misses. The first near miss of becoming Dracula occurred with the not-so-well-received Castlevania II, Simon's Quest, released originally for the Nintendo Entertainment System or NES in 1988, after first being released on the Famicom in 1987. In Simon's Quest, Simon Belmont realizes that he has been stricken with a dark curse by Dracula, whom he previously defeated in the original Castlevania. He now has a limited time over which he either cures himself of Dracula's curse given upon Dracula's defeat, or he dies and becomes Dracula. At the end of Simon's Quest, there are three possible endings. One is that Simon removes the curse of Dracula from himself and lives on. The second is that he defeats Dracula but still dies in illness, not becoming Dracula, but still brought down by the deadly toll of Dracula's curse on his body. The third and most horrifying is when Simon becomes Dracula, with his soul removed and Simon dead, but Simon's body becoming a vessel to Dracula's soul and Dracula returning. However, while he did not become the new Dracula, locals had great respect to Simon for saving their lives and accepted him. What his ultimate fate was isn't fully known, save that he continued the Belmont bloodline. This wasn't the last brush with death and near miss at becoming the new Dracula, which happened to a Belmont either. In Castlevania, Symphony of the Night, Richter Belmont had been cursed by the Dark Priest Shaft to become a servant of the darkness. In spite of apparently killing Shaft, Shaft had cursed Richter, and Richter Belmont grew increasingly crazy over his time following his apparent victory over Dracula and Shaft in Rondo of Blood. In the Castlevania Symphony of the Night prequel comic, Richter is now shown in Dracula's castle, almost in delusion of himself being the lord of Dracula's now resurrected castle, sitting upon Dracula's throne, speaking to paintings of Dracula's dead wife Lisa as if she was his lady, and confronting Alucard as his enemy. Unlike the possession of Simon earlier, Richter did not escape this curse alone. He was freed by Alucard, having returned from a long hibernation, with Alucard having been guided by Richter's relative Maria Renard. Dracula did succeed at possession of a new body through his dark curse, but his success was not in the Belmont bloodline. His success lay in his devil forge master, Isaac Laferez. Nonetheless, a Belmont defeating vampires only to become one came true in the Lords of Shadow reboot, where this nightmare concept was explored. The result was something too terrible for the original story, but nonetheless possible to be explored elsewhere. Alucard, or the son of Dracula, fathering children, was a concept teased since the year after Castlevania III.
Dracula's Curse in 1990. The result was a choose-your-own-adventure book, known in English as Legend of Satanic Castle. An unofficial sequel to Castlevania III, the book featured Layla, a young girl who was a direct blood descendant of Alucard, and by extension, Dracula, along with other peers. She takes part in the fight against Dracula long after the 1470s, in which the original Castlevania III occurs. This was before the nature of a natural-born human-vampire hybrid became retconned into Alucard's origin with Symphony of the Night, but it was nonetheless the father of the concept where Alucard fathered children. Alucard's original appearance in Castlevania III was that of Bela Lugosi in the 1931 Dracula film, and originally Alucard, as shown in Dracula's Curse, was born a human, but became vampiric due to his father's dealings with the devil. Now don't forget this concept, because it will return in Lords or Shadow. Either way, the idea in Legend of Satanic Castle is that in spite of Alucard being there, his own vampiric nature passed down to his children, grandchildren, or whatever generation Layla was after Alucard, making his children of vampiric bloodlines, but not necessarily full-blooded monsters. The idea of Alucard becoming a father was also presented in the 1997 Game Boy game known as Castlevania Legends. Among the last games before the Game Boy Color took over, Legends featured gameplay as a female playable character known as Sonia Belmont. Sonia fights through the game with a whip and other magic powers to fight the minions of Dracula, similar to Simon, Christopher, and Richter in the games featured before Legends. The game also features Sonia giving birth to her own son, implied to be Trevor Belmont, given that the game of Legends is set in 1450, between 20 and 30 years before Castlevania III Dracula's Curse. However, the ending of Legends had controversy, at the very least with the new and upcoming producer, Koji Igarashi. Igarashi ultimately chose to overwrite the origin of the Belmonts in Legends with Lament of Innocence, released in late 2003 in North America, and Japan and Europe and Australia received their release in early 2004.
Legends also had a proposed follow-up known as Castlevania Resurrection for the Sega Dreamcast, set to release in 2001, featuring Sonia Belmont and her distant descendant, Victor Belmont, meeting up in the 17th century via time travel. But that game was canceled in development in early 2000. There will be more regarding the concepts of resurrection later, but both Legends and Resurrection served as a pool from which ideas incorporated into the Lords of Shadow games would be derived over 1 decade later. While decanonized, the concept of Alucard being a father of the Belmonts was an interesting concept if further carried out as an alternate timeline. If Legends remained canonical, then Alucard, or Adrian Fahrenheit Tepes, meeting Trevor would be a reunion with his own long-lost son, and Dracula would be the patriarch of the Belmont family through his own son as well. Symbolically, Sonia and the Belmonts following her would be a counter to the evil of Dracula for generations, as Lisa Tepes once had become. The Belmonts would be in conflict with the wicked side of their own bloodline, as the younger Skywalkers in Star Wars had been in that franchise, with Luke and Leia being in conflict with their father, Anakin Skywalker, or Darth Vader. Furthermore, in a Legends continuity, how would Alucard handle the truth about his fatherhood over the Belmonts? Would he tell Trevor the truth? Even more so, would that be his explanation or justification for intervening in the world against Dracula, as he did in Symphony of the Night, or in the 1999 Demon Castle War alongside Julius Belmont? There was potential to be had in alternate reality stories from that now obsolete origin of the Belmonts. There was some additional stories removed from canon over the years as well, one being the character of Reinhard Schneider. Reinhard Schneider was the great-grandson of Richter Belmont, who carried on the legacy of the Belmonts after Symphony of the Night, in both Castlevania 64 and its improved version known as Legacy of Darkness. Reinhard, while not having the surname Belmont, was the great-grandson of Richter Belmont from Rondo of Blood and Symphony of the Night. Reinhard was taught the lore of the monsters by his father, Michael Schneider, who was the grandson of Richter. Michael Schneider is never mentioned by more than name in Reinhardt's story, but the name does turn up in Lords of Shadow, A later episode will discuss how a Castlevania timeline could work in the Schneiders while still keeping the name of Belmont in a later episode. As you may realize, Castlevania 64 was decanonized during the IGA era of Castlevania, but elements of Castlevania 64 and its improvement Legacy of Darkness will turn up in the Lords of Shadow timeline and be mentioned later in this episode. And with those points, Legends, Resurrection, and the Nintendo 64 Castlevania game served as the spiritual predecessors to what would come later in the Lords of Shadow reboot. The characters and the plot points not part of prior canon would be used to build the equivalent of a massive what if, or an Elseworld story only in Castlevania. Now that we have covered the origins of a number of concepts, now we will proceed into the actual Lords of Shadow. Warning, you are entering into spoiler territory for Lords of Shadow, and also to a similar game franchise known as Legacy of Kain. If you have not played or read the plot of either series, proceed at your own risk. Lords of Shadow begins in Anno Domini 1047 in Eastern Europe. The Lords of Shadow are poisoning the world and interrupting the natural cycle of life and death. The interruption of the cycle of life and death and its imbalances causes the rise of undead and unholy monsters, as well as a thinning of the gulf between earth and hell. A knight or holy warrior known as Gabriel Belmont is called to destroy the Lords of Shadow and bring balance and peace to the troubled world. Meanwhile, a creature of the night murdered Gabriel's wife, Marie, and her soul remains in limbo due to the cursed nature of the world due to the Lords of Shadow. The Lords of Shadow each represent a distortion of virtues, or the 7 deadly sins. Carmilla, not to be confused with Carmilla, the ally of Dracula in the canon Castlevania timeline, or Elizabeth Bartley, the niece of Dracula and cousin of Alucard. Carmilla in the Lords of Shadow represents lust, and the other Lords of Shadow represent greed, envy, wrath, and so on. Ultimately, it is revealed that the Lord of Death manipulated the events in the story, while himself influenced by a mysterious demon lord. I cannot blame you for thinking I was describing the plot of Blood Omen, Legacy of Kain, and such is possible, as the Legacy of Kain story has many parallels to that of Lords of Shadow, such as the Pillar Guardians representing aspects of humanity, like the Lords of Shadow, or the Hylden race being demonic, or Marie advising Gabriel from Limbo having a role similar to Ariel in advising the protagonists of Kain and Raziel to restore balance to the world, or many more parallels in the plot. Lords of Shadow also delivered a conclusion that myself and others who followed Legacy of Kain hoped for, but did not receive when the concluding game, Dark Prophecy, was cancelled. But the Legacy of Kain franchise will receive an introduction in a later episode after Resident Evil is introduced, as determined in a poll to my audience. Either way, in the Legacy of Kain game series, the plot began with Blood Omen, in which a chain of events was set off with the long-standing war between humans and vampires. A near annihilation of the vampires results in the desperate attack by a powerful vampire lord named Vorador to cripple the leadership of the human opposition known as the Circle of Nine by killing 6 out of 9 of the Guardians of the Pillars. The Pillars of Nosgoth in Legacy of Rain were anciently built as a magical barrier, obstructing the demonic race known as the Hylden from returning from the hellish plane of existence to which they were banished by the ancients, the forerunners to the vampires. With only 3 Pillar Guardians remaining, the Paladin and the Guardian of Conflict, known as Malik, was spared death by Vorador, only to be cursed to exist as a spirit-possessed empty suit of armor, possessing deadly telekinetic powers. But as mere spirit, he would no longer eat, drink, or breathe in this new existence, reduced to nothing but a seemingly invincible, eternally damned guardian of the Pillars. Vorador himself sought a fortress surrounded by marshlands full of poisonous monsters, dangerous to mortal humans and vampires alike to pass through without flight or vampiric abilities, to prevent vampiric extermination in retaliation, and also remain hidden from the affairs of humanity. While the Hylden were banished, they knew that the Pillars keeping them in exile were weakened by Vorador's purge of the Guardians, and thus the master of the Hylden in the demon realm concocted a plan. The Halden Lord, the master of the demons, reached into the material world, suggesting ideas into the mind of the morose Mortanius, the pillar guardian of death itself. Becoming corrupted over time by the demon lord, the Halden Lord became able to influence Mortanius to the extent where he could control Mortanius for increasingly longer periods of time, like a puppet. Using Mortanius as his puppet, the Halden Lord saw an opportunity to strike at the pillars by getting Mortanius to murder the pillar guardian of balance, Ariel, the love of another pillar guardian, Nuptraptor, with the murder of Ariel, Nuptraptor, the guardian of the mind, with immense telepathic and telekinetic powers, sunk into deep paranoia and wrath, telepathically assaulting the other pillar guardians with awful, hostile thoughts, driving madness among the existing pillar guardians and causing the pillars, which held the Halden in hell, to decay and crack. All in all, the Halden being banished and seeking entry and eventual rule over the world of humanity is very similar to the plot of Lucifer or Satan in Lords of Shadow, seeking a return and a conquest to the world of humanity, and Gabriel seeking to eliminate the Lords of Shadow by manipulation of Zobek, revealed to be the Grim Reaper in disguise, is very much the same plot as to how Mortanius, the pillar guardian of death in Nosgoth, arranging for the death of Kain, to set him on a purge of the corrupted pillar guardians and restore the pillars of Nosgoth. Zobek manipulated Gabriel under the influence of a cursed mask into the killing of his own wife Marie, in a similar manner to how the Halden Lord, or the Dark Entity, got Mortanius, the pillar guardian of death, to murder Ariel, the lover of Nuptraptor, corrupting the guardians and the pillars. In the end, the Lords of Shadow were as the pillar guardians, as once the Lords of Shadow had been leaders of virtue, but grew corrupt and became leaders of vices such as lust, envy, gluttony, sloth, or wrath. The big difference between Lords of Shadow and Legacy of Kain is that there wasn't any real time travel in the Lords of Shadow saga. In the Legacy of Kain series, every single game with the exception of Blood Omen 2 contains time travel, in the form of traveling back in time to alter the past. The closest aspect to time travel was that of Gabriel skipping ahead into the 21st century from medieval times through hibernation, inflicted by his son, Alucard, using the Crisegrim. In and of itself, somewhat similar to how Raziel removed the Heart of Darkness from Kain, killing him for a time before he could return to battle the Elder God. In that greater sense, the Lords of Shadow Alucard served a purpose similar to Raziel as a type of father and son relationship. At the end of the day, Legacy of Kain is a series I recommend to those who enjoy dark fantasy stories and wouldn't mind something similar to Castlevania or Legend of Zelda, where you go through dungeons full of traps and monsters and destroy various bosses. It is possible that both Lords of Shadow and Legacy of Kain took some inspiration from Legend of Zelda, which in all fairness wouldn't be without precedent, as the chief director of the Castlevania franchise, Koji Igarashi, explicitly stated that Legend of Zelda was his inspiration for the new Metroidvania style of Castlevania games. But was Zelda ever in side-scrolling form rather than top-down or 3D? Actually, yes, it was. Legend of Zelda 2, The Adventures of Link, plays as a side-scrolling game, and Link's Awakening for the Nintendo Game Boy has side-scrolling segments in the underground sections of the game. At the end of the day, maybe Lords of Shadow took some inspiration from Legacy of Kain, or maybe both Kain and Loss were inspired by Zelda, or possibly a combination of both. Either way, the plot of both games becomes pretty similar minus the time travel aspect. As mentioned in the introduction, Lords of Shadow experimented with concepts that were not canonical to the IGA Timeline, or in some cases, prior to the IGA Timeline. But how about concepts that were canonical previously? In Lords of Shadow, Alucard being born as a regular human man, as Trevor Belmont was not original, but largely similar to the original story of Alucard in Castlevania 3, Dracula's Curse, before that was retconned by Symphony of the Night, where Alucard was born as a vampire, human hybrid, who was later turned vampiric by Dracula. Another concept that existed, howbeit from the IGA Timeline, was that of the corrupt Chaos Stones. Chaos, who fills the role of Satan in the Lords of Shadow games, had 3 stones shown on his character: an ebony stone, a crimson stone, and an ochre stone. The ebony and the crimson stones were featured in Lament of Innocence, but no real featuring of an ochre stone was ever featured in the old Castlevania games, but it was featured in Lords of Shadow as an alternative timeline. The orange chaos, or ochre stone, was explained as being behind the destructive forces of ice and fire, expanding on a concept which wasn't explored fully in the traditional Castlevania. As mentioned earlier in the making of Lords of Shadow, the Belmonts and Dracula being of the same bloodline was another concept from Castlevania Legends, which was revisited in the Lords of Shadow reboot. In Legends, Alucard was the father of Trevor Belmont through his love interest and the playable protagonist of Sonia Belmont in Legends. Here, Alucard was a Belmont family member, though not in quite the same manner as Legends indicated he was. There is a rather complex Belmont family in Lords of Shadow. This Belmont family begins with the protagonist of the first Lords of Shadow, Gabriel Belmont, who becomes Count Dracula. His line continues with his son, Trevor Belmont, who continues with his wife, Sypha, on to Simon Belmont. Unlike in the original Castlevania, the Belmont hunters literally arrive in successive generations with no century gap, since the relationship between Dracula and Satan is not the same as in the traditional Castlevania timeline, along with the reorganization and return from the chaotic realm not taking place. Alucard, or the son of Dracula, does exist in Lords of Shadow, but his nature is quite different from the canon Alucard, since he is Trevor Belmont, unlike the canon Alucard, who was the son of Dracula, but just a friend of Trevor. Like Legends Alucard, Trevor Belmont continues or perpetuates the Belmont line as Trevor Belmont, only unlike in Legends, where Alucard perpetuated the line with Sonia as the father of Trevor. Alucard here is the father of an alternate version of Simon Belmont. Simon is playable as another version of Castlevania's most frequent playable character during the middle Lords of Shadow installment, known as Mirror of Fate. Even more references to Sonia and Legends persist in the disappointing conclusion to Lords of Shadow, known as Lords of Shadow 2. Victor Belmont, originally planned for the cancelled Castlevania Resurrection for Sega Dreamcast, finally appears to meet his grand ancestor Gabriel, who is now known as Count Dracula. Unlike the planned time travel plot for Castlevania Resurrection, Victor in Lords of Shadow does not travel back in time to meet his ancestor, the way he was planned to meet Sonia in the past. Rather, he meets Gabriel in the future, in 2057, as the last Belmont to serve as a vampire hunter for the Brotherhood of Light. As the last Belmont, Victor sacrifices himself to aid Dracula in his war against Satan. After Victor dies, Gabriel and Trevor, now Alucard, have the final piece of the Mirror of Fate needed to defeat and banish Satan, making Dracula and Alucard the last and first of the Belmont bloodline. The Alpha and the Omega, the Father and the Son. Unlike the traditional Castlevania, where the Belmont family wields a sacred vampire killer whip, the Belmonts, including Gabriel, wield a different kind of holy or unholy whip known as the Combat Cross. The Combat Cross functions as a holy whip, like the Belmonts used the whip in the original Castlevania games. This same cross also serves as a vampire impaling stake. Not only a whip and a stake, but after Gabriel's breaking of the Combat Cross, Trevor Belmont, now Alucard, used a broken piece of Gabriel's cross to make the Chrysogrim, a nod to Alucard's ultimate weapon in Symphony of the Night, like the original Chrysogrim, the Lords of Shadow. Alucard uses his special sword to leave Gabriel in a state of death for nearly 1,000 years, until he can be revived to fight the devil in the 21st century.
You drove into Camilla's heart. I found it in the castle, all those years ago. The first time we faced each other in combat. If your heart is pierced by this weapon, you will fall into...
Meanwhile, as the one who valiantly accompanied Gabriel in the original Lords of Shadow, the paladin and priest known as Zobek is revealed to be the Grim Reaper, or Death. Like in Castlevania, Curse of Darkness, Zobek used the disguise of a priest in Lords of Shadow the way Zed was a covert identity for the Grim Reaper in Curse of Darkness, along with the priestly disguise. Similar to in canonical Castlevania, Zobek was an alias of the Grim Reaper beginning with the letter Z, as the Grim Reaper in the canon of Castlevania under Igarashi or Iga had used the alias of Zed, also beginning with the letter Z and rhyming with the word dead. Other characters featured in previous Castlevania games were shown as a reimagining in Lords of Shadow. Notable cases include Cornel, the playable werewolf character from the Nintendo 64 game, Legacy of Darkness. In Lords of Shadow, Cornel is a ruler of the werewolves and a key adversary of Gabriel Belmont in the first Lords of Shadow game. His story was decolonized for the story of the Bloodlines saga, but a tribute was made to the iconic werewolf character with a new Cornel featured in Lords of Shadow. Michael Schneider was also mentioned in the related game manuals for Castlevania 64 and Legacy of Darkness as the father of the Castlevania 64, Belmont heir Reinhard Schneider. Michael Schneider in Castlevania 64 was the grandson of Richter Belmont, via Richter having a daughter, but nonetheless, Michael carried on the Belmont tradition to his son, Reinhard. The Castlevania 64 and Legacy of Darkness stories were removed from canon by Koji Igarashi due to conflicts with his vision of the Belmonts being out of being the main vampire hunters through the saga of Bloodlines, which covered Bloodlines and its sequel, Portrait of Ruin, where Alucard's role was replaced by the Alucard family, and the Belmonts were replaced for a time by the Morris family, until after the Bloodlines sequel, Portrait of Ruin, where Alucard and a Belmont returned to their old role for a confrontation with Dracula in 1999, with Alucard and Julius Belmont. In Lords of Shadow, Michael Schneider is a benevolent spirit who can be summoned by the alternate Simon Belmont in the Mirror of Fate installment. Like his original version, he helps the Belmont in their war on Dracula, but unlike his original version, he's not a Belmont descendant, as the original Michael Schneider was, nor does he have a son like Reinhardt. Among the elements crucial of the original Castlevania timeline was that of the demonically possessed castle, called Castlevania. Castlevania was the titular castle by which the games were originally named. The origin was drastically changed. Instead of directly being taken after a death of Walter Bernard, as occurred in the original Castlevania Timeline, Gabriel Belmont, or the new Count Dracula, obtained the castle after even more hands passed it down. The ownership was from a man named Bernhard, but obtained by Frankenstein, a reference to Frankenstein's monster being a recurring boss in the Castlevania games. A demon known as the Forgotten One was summoned by the Lords of the Haunted Castle, but the Forgotten One proved too powerful to be controlled by the Frankenstein or Bernhard families. The Holy Order of Monster Slayers, known as the Brotherhood of Light, fought the Forgotten One, sealing him within the castle and making the castle the living demonic entity as a result. Seemingly victorious, the Brotherhood of Light ascended into heaven. Unfortunately, they left behind unclean and unholy remains back in our material realm, and those remnants became the Lords of Shadow. One of the Holy Order was left behind as a female vampire lady, and the vampire lady became this timeline's version of Carmilla. Gabriel in the original Lords of Shadow would come to this haunted, possessed castle years later as part of the events of the original Lords of Shadow and defeat the Forgotten One, but unfortunately, he would become the new Lord of the Demon Castle, or the new timeline's Dracula. As Gabriel became Count Dracula, the castle would become symbiotic with him as the new lord of the castle. The castle would become a demonic entity as Gabriel had become corrupted himself, similar in the sense of a symbiotic demonic castle, but different from the original Castlevania in terms of the original origins, and not as unique or as prominent in the story. Also less significant is the vampire killer whip, or as it is known in Lords of Shadow. There is the combat cross instead of the alchemical whip, made holy, that we saw in Lament of Innocence. It's a weapon of a holy warrior such as Gabriel, a cross which can extend a whip. It wasn't really made in Lords of Shadow for a family feud, so much as it serves as a token of who Gabriel once was. Like the lightsaber is the weapon of a Jedi Knight, the combat cross with the whip option in the case of Gabriel and the other Lords of Shadow Belmonts. Overall, the myth of the traditional family heirloom was completely altered from something unique in the story into something very different, if not unrecognizable. As I mentioned earlier, the Belmont lineage in Lords of Shadow feels quite similar to that of the Skywalkers in the Star Wars saga. Gabriel has the similarity with Anakin Skywalker in the sense that he was seduced by the dark side in his war against the demons of hell. But like Anakin Skywalker, he was still the prophesied savior who brought down the evil when he slew Satan to save his own son, as Anakin Skywalker killed the Emperor for the sake of his own son, Luke Skywalker. At the end of the day, I feel that Lords of Shadow was worth it during the time it was released. The continuity from the IGA era was pretty crowded with common returns of Dracula, even trying over a century without the Belmonts to have Alucard and the Belmonts return for 1999 and the Sorrow era. But it was a great way to explore the concepts that didn't make it into canon, including the idea from legends that the Belmonts and Dracula were one and the same bloodline, along with Dracula, or Gabriel Belmont, actually being the true and tragic figure that fulfills the prophecy, similar to mythical figures such as Samson, Oedipus Rex, or Kullervo, Ishikawa Gomen, or in more modern myths, Anakin Skywalker. Lords of Shadow gave a direction to what previously did not have a direction, from what was not in canon into what was part of a greater story, an alternate story. That story had its beginning, and that story had its end. That ending stood, along with the ending of Dawn of Sorrow, as a final gaze into the rising sun. I was also disappointed with how Lords of Shadow 2 ended. Not as great, in my opinion, as the prior Castlevania games, but a Castlevania saga nonetheless. Hello there, Agent Fahrenheit Tepes or Alucard here, and this is another one of my episodes of Castlevania lore. I plan on doing more in this and other series that I'm working on, and I have the links to other series in the description and in the cards for this video. If you want to ask a little bit more discussion and suggestions to me on what I can make in future content, you can consider joining my Discord or commenting here on the video. And I look forward to saying more in future episodes. I want to say thank you to the various audience and other individuals who support and encourage my work. And until we meet again, farewell.